Hi, good evening, good morning, whenever you see the lecture. Hoping you're doing great, hoping you're well prepared for your exams and ready to move on to the next stage of our semester. Definitely, you're so busy with preparing for the midterm. I want to wish you all the best and always remember that it is all about what you want to be in this world. Let's talk more and more about political science in this section. We started to talk about Roman Greek issues and the development and the economic political track. We talked about the city state. We talked about how both Roman, Italian, Greek people started democratic idea or phenomenon. We even talked about their perspective about democracy. In this lecture, we're going to discuss more and more about the historical aspect of democracy. Um, in this lecture, we're going to determine the entire lecture discussing what we call a democratic dilemma. The historical democratic dilemma, how and in which sense we still see democracy derived from the historical track of both Greek, Roman, and all the ancient communities. The Greeks, the Romans, and the leaders of the Italian republics were pioneers in creating popular governments, and their philosophers and thinkers exercised enormous influence on later political thought. Actually, no one can deny ever that political science is a derived section from the history and the culture of Greek, Roman, and Italian culture. Yet, these cultures, these um, uh, citizens, um, are a little bit ambiguous, a little bit confusing, and very interesting in discussing. Uh, their political institutions were not developed by the later foundation of democratic governments in the term of nation states, neither of Northern Europe nor North America. As the expansion of Rome had already demonstrated, these institutions were simply not suited to political associations significantly larger than the city-state. The enormous difference in size between what they called city-state and a nation-state points to a fundamental dilemma. So the dilemma we are dealing with is how to differentiate between what we call city-state, nation-states, and the political, let's call development of each track. By limiting the size of city-states, citizens can, in principle, if not always in practice, directly influence the conduct of their government. But by participating either in assembly or in their own special ways. But limiting size comes at a cost. Important problems, notably defense against large and more powerful states, and the regulation of trade and finance will remain beyond the capacity of the government to deal with efficiently. Alternatively, by increasing the size of the city-state, for example, by enlarging the geographic area, the population, the number of classes, the classification of people, the number of citizens, etc. All the increasing of these elements with um, the numerous integrative elements can increase the capacity of the government to deal with important problems, but only at the cost of reducing their opportunities to influence the government directly through assemblies or other means. So there is a weird relation between the size of the state and the way they used to participate in. Many city-states responded to this dilemma by forming alliances or confederations with other city-states and with larger political associations. But the problem would not finally be solved until the development of representative governments, which first appeared in Northern Europe in 18th century. Toward representative democracy, Europe and North America to 19th century. After the previous dilemma, after discussing the dilemma between city and nation state and how the justification that Greek and Roman gave, now we're going to discuss the other part of the dilemma. Until the 17th century, democratic theorists and political leaders largely ignored the possibility that a legislature might consist neither of the entire body of citizens, as in Greeks and Roman, nor of representatives chosen by and from tiny oligarchy or hereditary aristocratic classes, as in the Italian republics, for example. An important break in the prevailing orthodoxy occurred during and after actually the English Civil War, when uh, when pacific events happened, changed the perspective how people see and translate the actions among cities and among countries. Um, this particular war is a real joint in the history. In parallel level, we can see other radical followers that demanded um, border representation in parliament, expanding powers from parliament's lower house, what they call the House of Commons, and universal methods suffrage. And as with many political innovations, representative government resulted less from philosophical classification than from a search for particular solutions to fairly self-evident problem. Nevertheless, the complete assessment assimilation of representation into the theory and practice of democracy was still more than a century away. Let's talk about the regional developments or the continental Europe. About 800 CE, freemen and nobles in various parts of northern continental Europe began to participate directly in local assemblies, to which were later added regional and national assemblies consisting of representatives, some or all of whom came to be elected. In the mountain valleys of the Alps, such assemblies developed into self-governing countries or states or places, leading eventually to the founding of what we called later the Swiss Confederation. And the Swiss Confederation was established in the 13th century. Later on, local assemblies were also established. For example, Vikings were meeting in many areas of Europe. Eventually, the Vikings realized that to deal with certain larger problems, they needed more inclusive associations and assemblies. And in Norway, Sweden, Denmark, regional assemblies developed as a result of that awareness. In 930, Viken in Ireland created the first example of what today would be called a national assembly, a legislative parliament that could we call it a national assembly. In later centuries, representative institutions also were established in the emerging nation state of Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Switzerland, and the Netherlands. The emergence of these states, because um, um, they are not the sons and the daughters of these empires. They were trying and suffering to build their own independent units, so it was more easier for them to have their own pattern of democracy. Okay, let's talk now about England. Among the assemblies created in Europe during the Middle Ages, the one that most profoundly influenced the development of representative government was the English Parliament. Less a product of design than an unintended consequence of opportunistic innovations. Parliament grew out of councils that were called by the kings for the purpose of redressing certain political, economic, social issues and for exercising judicial functions. In time, Parliament began to deal with important matters of state, notably the raising of the revenues, the economic issues, the need to support the policies and decision making of the monarchy system. As its judicial functions were increasingly delegated to courts, it gradually evolved into a legislative body. And this is the first signs to have what we call later on separation between powers. By the end of the 15th century, the England system displayed some of the basic features of modern parliamentary government. For example, the enrollment of certain separation. Uh, they had certain laws, norms required the passage of bills by both houses of parliament and the formal approval of the monarchy system. They had this kind of a dual system that enabled them to establish later on to a very strong parliament and parliamentary system. Actually, no one can deny that the English system and the English track of building democracy is one of the most remarkable systems all over the history. They established a very strong base, whether based on the constitution or the structure of the institutions and constitutions themselves. Other important features had yet to be established, however. England's political life was dominated by the monarchy for centuries after the Middle Ages. During the English Civil War, as we said before, this wars was one of the most remarkable stages, joints in the history of political science in general. So during these wars, um, it led on one side by radical Puritans that actually the monarchy was abolished and a republic occurred. The Commonwealth was established. A lot of changes according to the democratic political structure. Though the monarchy was restored by the 1660, it still certain core changes happened. Later on 1080, significant powers, notably including powers related to the appointment and tenure and the prime ministers, had shifted to parliament. This development was strongly influenced by the emergence of political factions in parliament during the early years of the 18th century. These factions, known as Whig and Tories, later became full-fledged parties. What I want you to understand from this is one important point, that the English system is one of the most remarkable systems. It is a model of the changes that happened to the political track and the emergence of democracy, and the changes and two patterns and the norms, laws, and the institutional level. To king and parliament alike, it became increasingly apparent that laws could not be passed or nor taxes raised without the support of Whig or Tory leader who could muster a majority of votes in the House of Commons. To gain that support, the monarch was forced to select a prime minister, the leader of the majority party in the Commons, and to accept the leader's suggestions for the composition of the cabinet. That the monarch should have to yield to Parliament in this era because manifest during constitutional crisis, for example, in 1782, when King George III was complete, much against his will, to accept a Whig prime minister and cabinet, a situation he regarded, according to one scholar, a violation of constitution, a defeat for his policy, and a personal humiliation. Actually, this example is a very nice example to see that the change was a result of very dynamic actions and events inside the community. Parliamentary government in Britain was not yet a democratic system, actually, mainly because of propriety requirements. The franchise was held by only about 5% of the British population over 20 years of age. The Reform Act of 1832, which is in general viewed as the historical threshold in the development of parliamentary democracy in Britain, extended the suffrage to about 7% of the adult population. It would require further acts of parliament in later 18th century to achieve what they called universal male suffrage, and one more law enacted in 1928 to secure the right to vote for all adult women. This is one important date, like by 1928, it is the law that accepts women to vote and politically participate. After talking about England, let's talk now about the United States. Whereas the visibility of representative government was demonstrated by the development of parliament, the possibility of joining representation and democracy first became fully evident in the government of the British colonies of North America and later in foundation of United States of America. Conditions in colonial America favored the limited development of a system of representation more broadly based than the one in use in Great Britain. These conditions, including the vast distance from London, which forced the British government to grant significant autonomy to the colonies. The existence of colonial legislation system in which representatives in at least one house were elected by voters, the expansion of the suffrage, which in some colonies came to include most adult white males, the spread of property ownership, particularly in land, and the strengthening of beliefs in fundamental rights and popular sovereignty, including the belief that colonists, as British citizens, should not have to pay taxes to government in which they were not represented. So no taxes without representation. This is one important change, joint in the history of the colonies of Britain. Okay, we have a very important question we need to have an answer. Is it democracy or republic? According to all what we were talking about, is this democracy or it is republic? And democracy is the most appropriate name for a large-scale representative system, such as that of the early United States. What can we call it? Let's talk about the end of the 18th century. The history of the terms holds that was written in most of the literature. Rule by the people. Does it refer to the idea of democracy? Does it refer to the idea of republic? Okay, democracy and republic left the answer unclear. Both terms had been appealed to the assembly-based system of Greek and Roman, though neither system assigned legislative power to representatives elected by members of the demos. As noted above, even after Roman citizenship was expanded beyond the city itself and increasing numbers of citizens were prevented from participation in government by the time, expenses and hardship of travel to the city, the complex Roman system of assemblies was never replaced by a government of representatives, or what we can call it later a parliament, elected by all Roman citizens. Vietnamese also called the government of their famous city a republic, though it was certainly not democratic. So, does democracy and republic are two faces of one coin? We don't know. You need to seek and search and understand more where these terms were used and in which sense they were used to explain issues and to give meaning for issues that it could be, in one sense, translated into democracy, and the other sense translated into republic. After the previous discussion and all we talked about the changes in the history and the appraising of certain phenomena, the changes of the characteristics and the elements, features, etc. Let's try to solve a little bit this dilemma. I just want to remember you that we are talking about two dilemmas: state versus nation, democracy versus republic. By the end of the 18th century, both the idea and the practice of democracy had been profoundly transformed. Political theorists and statesmen now recognize what the liberals had seen earlier, that the non-democratic practice of representation could be used to make democracy practicable and usable in the large nation state of the modern era. Representation, in other words, was the solution to the ancient dilemma between enhancing the ability of political associations to deal with large-scale problems and preserving the opportunity of citizens to participate in governments and decision-making process. To some of those steeped in the older tradition, the union of representation and democracy seemed a marvelous and apical invention. In the early 19th century, the French author, for example, Tracy, who is the inventor of the term ideology, insisted that representation had rendered absolute the doctrine of both Montesquieu, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who both had denied that representative governments could be generally democratic. So, if one say that these changes created democracy, we have the other perspective like Tracy, who created the idea or the concept of ideology, who believed that this representation system will never ever produce a democratic system. Representation or representative government, according to him, he said, may be considered as a new invention unknown in Montesquieu's time. Representative democracy is democracy rendered practicable for a long time and over a great extent of territory. In 1820, the English philosopher James Mill proclaimed that the system of representation to be the grand discovery of modern time, in which the solution of all the difficulties, both particular, practical, speculative, will perhaps be found. One generation later, Mill's son, the philosopher John Stuart Mill, concludes all these thoughts and his considerations on representative government. He was talking about the ideal type of a perfect government. According to him, this ideal type would be both democratic and representative. First headwing developments that would take place in the 20th century, the demos of Mill's representative democracy included definitely women. So the only remarkable change is that more awareness to differentiate between the track of representative governments and democracy, and all of them convinced that women nowadays are a core component of the democratic political operation and process, that no one can ever deny or can ever exclude them anymore. Okay, we reached to the end of this lecture. I just want to wrap up certain issues or five elements. Number one, the dilemma between city state and nation state. Number two, the progress of English system, the remarkable consistency and component of the English system, the track of the American democracy, and the importance of the awareness that led to the women participation in the political process and operation and decision making process. The last one, whether it is democracy or republic, it is all about who, where, and when these terms were used, and who exactly implemented the features of these terms. Thank you so much for joining me in this lecture. Please be safe and see you soon.